So what it might take you 20 years to achieve, from an organic matter standpoint with just straight no-till, you might accomplish that in 7 or 8 years with no-till and cover crops. You can really speed that up. And then if you throw well integrated livestock into that mix, you'll probably make all those achievements in 5 years or less. That's where we really see the system start to kick in and make it happen. So it kind of all depends on how you're set up, what your goals are, how fast you want to push it. But cover crops and no-till work really well together.
I'm Sarah, editor at Dakota Farmer Magazine.
And I'm Curt, editor at Nebraska Farmer, and you are listening to FP Next.
Curt, we've got all kinds of questions like when should I terminate my cover crops? What cover crop mixtures will work best on my farm? What if my cash crop is harvested late? Are there seed mixes that will still work? How do cover crops impact my herbicide weed control strategy?
Yeah, do you have major challenges and questions like these about adopting cover crops on your farm? Because if you do, you are not alone. So it might be worth your while to listen in for the next few minutes as our guest, Keith Berns from Green Cover, offers genuine solutions to many of your most pressing cover crop questions.
Of course, Curt, FP Next is the award-winning farmer and rancher-driven podcast from Farm Progress, and we're offering the latest and most useful information you need to know about what's next in agriculture.
That's right, Sarah, and we're bringing our listeners what's next in ag tech, in beating tough farm challenges like adopting cover crops, and what's next to help you be more profitable. But along the way, we also like to have a little fun.
We absolutely always have fun, but I think we should get right into business here because we got a lot to discuss. And of course, we want to remind our listeners right away that if you have more cover crop questions that are not answered in this episode, or if you've gained some help from this podcast, drop us an email or review the podcast to let us know how we're doing and what you think. And any of the articles and links we talk about will be added into the episode description below. And Curt, today we have a topic that many farmers are really interested in. It seems like it's always gaining more traction. The USDA 2022 Census of Agriculture found nearly 18 million acres of cover crops were being planted in the U.S., and that's up quite a bit from the previous census in 2017. We know farmers are interested in cover crops, and I think now we're kind of past the whole, are cover crops good discussion. They are good, but to a lot of farmers, especially in the more arid climates like our own regions, the good old Dakotas, they might struggle to implement these cover crops without dinging their cash crop profits.
So that's right, Sarah, and that's why today we have one of our country's best and most well-known experts on cover crops. And although he's kind of a world traveler, Green Cover's based right in south central Nebraska at Bladen. And we want to give a warm FP Next welcome to Keith Berns, co-founder and business visionary for Green Cover. Welcome, Keith, to FP Next.
Yeah, thank you, Curt, and thank you, Sarah, for having me on the show.
Absolutely. We're so excited that you're able to join us. And Keith, we know that you co-founded Green Cover with family and that your family is intimately involved in the business, but you grew up a farmer first. Can you tell us a little bit about your early days, college life, and kind of how Green Cover came to be?
Yeah, sure. So my brother, Brian, and I, we grew up on the farm right here in Bladen, Nebraska, south central. So we're about 30 miles south of Hastings, Nebraska. Grew up there farming all of our lives. I went to school at the University of Nebraska. Actually, was roommates with Curt, so we won't tell stories on each other because that would take the whole time. But really, I had a degree in ag education, and I came out of there and I taught school for 10 years, and then came back to the farm when my dad was getting ready to retire. My brother had already started down the path of doing no-till, and we went all in with no-till. And then as we continued to learn how the soil works, how systems works, and we started learning about cover crops, what they could do, and we really saw firsthand on our own operation the power of that diversity of biology and what that brought to the table. We decided we were looking to a way to expand the business anyway, to allow some of the kids to come back and be part of it if they wanted to. And we chose to start Green Cover rather than trying to find additional farm ground to farm as our way of expanding. And it's turned out to be a good bet. It's paid off quite well.
Digging directly into the cover crops, which is really something that so many farmers are very interested in. I think it's interesting because when I was a kid, I heard stories of farmers, putting a little bit of turnip seed on the fender when they were cultivating to try and get some cover crops going in for some grazing, so it's not a new idea, but it certainly is catching fire across the country. But It's not always a perfect line to get cover crops adopted into your rotation, as you well know, talking with your customers and from your own experience. So what are the top 2 or 3 questions about adding cover crops that you get from your farmer customers? I mean, what are the big obstacles that keep them up at night?
Well, probably the biggest one, and this is where we were too, is are they going to use too much moisture, and is that going to really limit me for that next crop? That was really our big concern. And back in 2008, we really wanted to answer that question for our own operation. So we applied for a SARE grant, Sustainable Ag Research and Education. We got like $5,000, and we used it to buy moisture sensors. And so we planted these strips of monoculture cover crops, and we planted all of these things together in a big diverse mix, a couple different mixes, and we put these moisture sensors in at 1 foot, 2 foot, and 3 foot. This is summer planted cover crops after we had harvested wheat. And 2008, we actually had some rainfall that summer. And so everything looked pretty good. Nothing really suffered. And if you were to just drive past and look, you were like, oh, yeah, that all looks about the same. But what the moisture sensors told us is that anywhere we had something by itself, and it didn't matter if it was cowpeas or sorghum or clover or radishes, anything by itself really had pulled the moisture levels down on that soil quite a bit. But where we had those diverse mixes, and these were 8, 10 way mixes, of different plants from different plant families, the results were pretty stunning. And the moisture sensors told us that the moisture is being used so efficiently that there really wasn't that much less moisture in those plots than there was where we had just plain wheat stubble, because it was losing some moisture, from evaporation. And so, and we corroborated that with work that Gabe Brown has done, and Jay Fuhrer and Dwayne Beck. They've all shown similar things, that where you have these diverse cover crop mixes and you give it some time, you will recover the moisture that the cover crop uses, because you're going to get a better infiltration, you're going to have less evaporation. So when we saw that, and we saw how well the livestock did on it as well, we really kind of put the moisture question, not necessarily just behind us, but we felt like it could work. But you have to manage it. You can't put a big cover crop in the fall, have it overwinter, let it grow like crazy, and then just plant a dryland cover crop into it, or a dryland cash crop into it in the spring, and expect that to work. That's a recipe for disaster. So will cover crops work everywhere? Yes, I think they will, but the way that you integrate them into your system is going to be completely different in an arid environment versus a moisture-rich environment. We treat our dryland acres like a different system than we treat our irrigated acres because they just fit in differently, but they still fit. So probably the moisture use is probably the biggest one. Um, of course, just how will they get it terminated? That's always a big one too. Nobody likes to spend more money on herbicide, and most people don't really like doing tillage. And so the termination question, and it's really a very important question to answer, because most train wrecks, most economic losses that happen with cover crops are because you didn't terminate it either on time, or you didn't terminate it completely and it kind of grew back and then really started being competitive with your next crop. And so that's probably one of the areas where people make mistakes the most, is on the termination.
I think everybody, when they think of soil health, like cover crops is one of the first thing that pops into their mind. But the truth is, of course, cover crops do so much more for your farm than just build soil health. I think that'll be a really interesting part of our discussion here today. And, kind of like you said, the integrated system of the livestock, the water, the cover crops, all these things you do together. And like we talk about every time, every farm's a little bit different. And you touch on this a little bit, but how do you decide on termination timing? Can you give us some examples, maybe solutions you've had that you've worked with your customers about?
Well, Sarah, the easiest thing, and this is a great place to start, if people have a summer harvested crop in the rotation. So, and unfortunately, that's not as common as it used to be. But if you are growing wheat or oats or rye or something like that, the absolute slam dunk on a cover crop is you plant that in that late summer time frame. August is the greatest month ever to plant a cover crop, because we can plant cool season, we can plant warm season, we can have the greatest amount of diversity. It will grow really, really well for about 8 weeks, and then eventually the winter is going to kill it all out, and you have no termination you have to do. The winter takes care of that for you in our region. Now, as you go south, people complain about, some of these things turning into almost perennials because they don't get cold enough to kill it. But, for most of the audience that are probably listening to this, we can count on winter to kill that. So that's just a really nice system because those decisions are really taken out of your hands. When we're planting in a corn soybean rotation or any type we're planting after a fall harvested crop, it gets a little bit more difficult. So you have to decide, do I want something that's going to overwinter, cereal rye, triticale, hairy vetch, winter clovers, things like this. And then I do have to make those decisions in the spring about termination. If you get things out early enough, or if you're far enough south, you can plant some things like oats and radishes and crimson clover that, you can probably get 60 days of decent growth on that. You'll have some, some respectable growth, and then the winter will still take that out. So that could work with, early silage or, wet corn, even possibly. You can fly that on if you get hailed out corn late in the season. So there's opportunities like that if you can get that seeded, and then the winter will still take that out. But for the ones that are planting overwintering cover crops, like the rye and triticales and vetches and winter clovers, you will have to make that decision in the spring of when you're going to terminate that. And that is not going to be the same every year. You cannot go by a calendar on that. You're going to have to read the room. And this is where cover cropping becomes as much of an art as a science. You need to know, is it going to be a wet spring, a dry spring? And of course, that's hard to predict. But every farmer kind of has a gut instinct of what it's looking like and what it's shaping up to be like. And on our irrigated, we'll push the limits on that. And sometimes we'll plant green into cover crops, and we will end up running our pivots a couple times before a lot of our neighbors will, because we planted into a drier environment. However, we probably run them 3 or 4 times less later in the season because of all of the soil benefits that we built up with the cover crop. So with irrigation, it becomes just a matter of, I might shift my timing on some of that a little bit. On dry land, we're going to err on the side of caution. We're going to terminate those cover crops earlier if it's feeling like it's a dry spring. Even though we may not have got the benefits that we had hoped for, we know we still got some benefits, and we still got some erosion prevention. I can almost eliminate mare's tail with 40 pounds of cereal rye, and I can still terminate that by the end of August, when that rye is not very big, but I can still really take care of that type of problem. So it's still worth doing. But if it's going to be dry, we're going to pull the trigger on that much earlier than we would if it feels like it's a wet spring, or if I'm in a wetter type of environment.
Yeah, and rye will solve a lot of weed problems, not just mare's tail. So that's certainly a great benefit to that. And talking about corn and soybeans, you mentioned, especially if you're cutting silage, you get that out early, which a lot of our, publications cover states that have a lot of silage, and Nebraska is one of them. That works out pretty well. So, what are the big questions you get from corn and soybean producers, who would like to get the cover crops in? How can it be done? Do they, can they change their rotations in a way that isn't, a terrible, seismic shift, I guess, in order to get cover crops to work for them? And I think you kind of started that answer right there with the termination answer.
Yeah, and one of the biggest fallacies that people probably have is, it's too late to plant cover crops. Here we are, November 11th. It's too late to plant cover crops. Well, it's too late to plant most cover crops, but not all. Cereal rye, it's number one for a reason. We sell more rye. Every cover crop company out there probably sells more rye than anything else, because it will germinate in 34-degree soils. Nothing else does that. It's a superpower that it has, and it stays green all winter. And so if it's 38 degrees and the sun is shining, 38 or higher and the sun is shining, that plant's photosynthesizing. It's taking sunlight, it's making root exudates. It's not growing super fast, but it's growing and it's living, and it's keeping your soil alive and keeping your biology fed. And so, we've planted rye, all the way through November and even into December, and we've had customers do the same thing. But again, rye will germinate at 34 degrees, and all it has to do to vernalize, it just has to sprout. And once it's sprouted and then it goes dormant and it's vernalized, it takes off faster than anything else in the spring. That's why it's so good at that early season weed control, especially against winter annuals like the mare's tail. henbit, things like that. It almost completely eliminates those because those weeds are very poor competitors. It's just that there's nothing out there to compete with them normally that time of year. So a modest amount of rye, even planted late, can have really good benefits. So that's probably one of the biggest things that we try to get people to understand is that you haven't missed that opportunity. You haven't missed that window. Now, we would love to see them put something else in there, some hairy vetch or some rapeseed or something like that. But if it gets too late, we're not going to encourage that. It's always better to plant a diverse mix, but there's no shame in planting rye by itself if that's the only thing that works, because it's a whole heck of a lot better than planting nothing.
Absolutely. I know I did a story earlier this year, which of course I'll link it, but it was a few other individuals who work with a cover crop seed company, and they were talking about starting small and starting simple when you're working with cover crops. And they were like, don't do like 5, 7, 10 way seed mixes right away. Just start with 1 or 2. And that sounds exactly like what you're saying. Use that good old rye and just start small.
Yeah, for sure. And do it into your corn stalks where you're going to be planting beans next year, because that's a much, much safer place to start, because one of the, cereal rye has a lot of superpowers, germinates at 34 degrees, photosynthesizes at 38. And it's a tremendous scavenger of nitrogen. It will just soak up any nitrogen that's in the soil, and it will hold on to it. It prevents it from leaching away, which, with all of the nitrates in our groundwater issues, that's a pretty big deal in itself. But that can be a detriment if you're planting corn into that, and now all of a sudden you don't have any nitrogen in your soil. It's not out of the system, it's just not in your soil. So if you're planting corn into cereal rye, you really have to manage your nitrogen, especially that early season. And again, that's where the management really has to come into it. You have to understand how that's working and know how to manage that. But with soybeans, that's actually a great advantage to have all that nitrogen tied up, because the soybeans will not encourage the rhizobia nodulation. It won't feed all the carbon resources to those guys to fix all that nitrogen. If there's 30, 40, 50 pounds of nitrogen in your soil, which there often is, it will use that up first, and then it nodulates later. And so when you plant soybeans into a growing rye crop, or a rye crop that has all that tied up, the soybeans look around and they go, oh my gosh, there's no nitrogen here at all. We need to get to work. They nodulate early, they nodulate often. And then when that rye does start to break down in July and in August, it releases, maybe it's got 20, 30 pounds of nitrogen. And that gives you that little bit of extra nitrogen for that yield boost later in the season. So that's the easiest, the safest, the most conservative way. Soybeans really don't get hurt by early competition. Corn really can. So you got both the nitrogen and the competition issue. So that's by far the best way to get started. And then once you get some experience with that, you can start looking at other things. Can I do some hairy vetch ahead of my corn? Maybe something like winter barley that's not quite as aggressive as cereal rye. How do I manage that? But we would echo the fact that if you're nervous about it, start small, but get started. Because if you don't do anything, you're going to be sitting around a year from now and you'll have the same questions that you have right now.
And go ahead and talk to people who have been doing this for a little while, and so you don't have to reinvent the wheel too.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the big questions I hear from people who are, trying cover crops is from our no-tillers. We've got a ton of great no-tillers in Nebraska, across the plains, and sometimes, that can be a little bit, or years ago, I guess it was more of a concern maybe than it is today, because I think the strategies have come a long way in understanding how to make it all work. So how would you say, with the no-till side of it, how is that working with some of your cover crop customers?
Well, the two go hand in hand really, really well. We probably were no-tilling for 20 years before we really ever started down the cover crop path. And what we saw is that, we picked up some pretty good gains early on with no-till, and they continued, but it felt like they just kind of got slower and slower and slower. We had got a lot of the goodie out of the system, and so now it was really slowing down. And part of that's because, no-till without the living root of the cover crop is still going to be a carbon limited system. Now, we're not getting rid of as much carbon because we're not tilling, but we still don't have those infusions of liquid carbon through the cover crop. So what it might take you 20 years to achieve, from an organic matter standpoint with just straight no-till, you might accomplish that in 7 or 8 years with no-till and cover crops. You can really speed that up. And then if you throw well-integrated livestock into that mix, you'll probably make all those achievements in 5 years or less. That's where we really see the system start to kick in and make it happen. So it kind of all depends on how you're set up, what your goals are, how fast you want to push it. But cover crops and no-till work really well together. Uh, Again, the turbination is one of the bigger things. Now if you're organic, and we have some really good no-till organic customers that are making it work with no to very limited tillage, and they're controlling their cover crops with roller crimpers and mechanical means like that. That's really hard. I mean, that is a super high management system, but when they make it work, which isn't every year, but hey, who makes it work every year for any system, right? When they make it work, it's beautiful because they have no inputs. They have no fertilizer. They have no chemicals. They've got the cover crop. They're rolling it down. They're planting their next crop. It's a beautiful system. And so it can work, but certainly not where you'd want to start. But yeah, no-till and cover crops, the biological principles go hand in hand. And it's strange because most of the guys we started working with were no-tillers who adopted cover crops. But as we expanded our geographic footprint a little bit, because we sell to customers in all 50 states now, we started finding people, especially in the South, they've been doing cover crops, but they've never done no-till. And that was really, that was hard for us to kind of figure out. And so, just helping them bring all those systems together. And, tillage is a tool like anything else, like a herbicide. Tools are expensive and you should only use them when you need to. Otherwise, all of your profit gets tied up in your tools.
So it's kind of like that whole integrated system that we've been talking about this whole time. And I know you mentioned you got customers in all 50 states. And those agronomists that I mentioned I was visiting with earlier, they were talking a lot about how government programs kind of drove the expansion of cover crops in a lot of our Western regions and our Western environments. But what part of the country is kind of seeing the greatest growth in cover crop area? And do you think there's a reason behind that?
Well, that's a great question, Sarah. If you look at just percentage of farmed acres that are being cover cropped, it's not even close. That Atlantic region, the Chesapeake Bay region, is by far higher than anybody else. Pennsylvania leads the pack, Maryland. But those guys have been getting paid $60, $70, $80 an acre to do cover crops for 20 years. Because they've got a huge tax base for a relatively small land base. So they can afford to do that. And they've really done a nice job of making the Chesapeake Bay a much better watershed. And they've cleaned that up. And it's really a great testimony to what can be done. But again, they were able to pay for that because of just that ratio of taxpayers to land base. We can't do that in the Mississippi watershed because we've got so much land and just not nearly as many people. So we're never going to see that type of incentivized adoption in our area. But I think where we see the biggest growth of cover crops, it's in areas where you have these three things come together. Number one, you have cattle, because cattle are the biggest way to monetize cover crops, especially now. But even back when cattle were just at normal prices, it was still very profitable to do so. So you got to have cattle, you got to have rainfall, because if you're going to really push the system and try to have cover crops and not necessarily interrupt your cash cropping sequence, that pushes that system to where you're going to need the moisture to do that. And then you need growing season. Because again, if you want to expand how much you're growing, you've got to have growing degree days. You need heat units in order to do that. So that's where we're seeing growth, and that's where we're seeing that's where we think more growth could happen. However, with all that being said, it's also really interesting that we're seeing a lot of interest pick up in areas that you wouldn't think, like western Kansas and eastern Colorado and western Nebraska, and you would think, man, those guys are so dry. You wouldn't think they could do that at all. But they're starting to look at the aquifer that is shrinking in those areas, and they're saying we can't continue to grow irrigated corn after irrigated corn after irrigated corn. So they're starting to shift the rotations and trying to figure out how can we still grow, lots of forage, but do it with less water. And the cover crops used as forages are going to be part of that answer. And I think we'll continue to see that pushed into, especially as they just run out of water and they're forced to do that, or if there are some restrictions put on and they have to work within the confines of that system.
Plus those more arid areas that you were talking about, usually there's some beef involved in those operations. So that really, like you say, really helps pay. Our good friend who you know, Jeff Steffen up here in Cedar County, my neighbor over here, has done a really good job of putting, numbers with his cover crops. He's been cover cropping for a long time and putting numbers as far as, what it costs and then what he thinks he gets out of it. Even from a financial standpoint, even without a carbon program payment of any kind, but it takes some patience. So what are, in your soil structure, I know you could write a book about this and maybe you should someday, but what are the really long-term benefits? Because farmers care about, the next generation and the next generation. I mean, the family members who are going to be on this land for a long time. What are those long-term benefits to the soil, to the land that come from cover crops in the long run?
Yeah, that's a great question, Curt. And, we definitely see the people who are the most dedicated to doing not only cover crops, but soil health practices in general are the ones who own the land or have long-term control over the land. Because, much of what we're talking about, whether it's no-till or cover crops or crop rotation, any of these things, you are building equity into that ground. As you add carbon, as you add nutrients, as you add aggregation, you're making that land more valuable. And I'm willing to do that if it's my own land. I might be willing to do that if it's land that I know I've got a 5-year lease on. I'm probably not willing to do that if I might not be farming that next year. And unfortunately, what landlords don't understand is when the only thing they're worried about is getting top dollar cash rent, even if they have to switch tenants year after year after year, they are incentivizing those tenants to essentially mine and rape and pillage that soil for everything it's worth, because they have to if they're going to squeeze out any profit. And I wish landlords understood that and would understand how they can not have to have top dollar in the short run to increase the value of their asset in the long run. And so, really what we see, people looking at in the long term is how fast can I build my soil organic matter? And what we saw when we were doing just no-till by itself, maybe 0.05% per year. So 20 years to get 1% of organic matter. That would be if you're just in kind of a traditional no-till setting. Now if you're not no-till and you're just doing corn and soybeans, you probably won't even stay even. You're probably going down every year. But with just no-till, we think 0.05 a year. When you add cover crops into that, we think you can get 0.1 per year. So 10 years you can gain 1% of organic matter. We have seen that time and time again. Have had customers tell us that. And then when you add livestock, when you add properly managed cattle, again, we think that speeds up to probably maybe 5, 6, 7 years. You can gain that percent. So that's a big deal. That's a lot of carbon. Because organic matter is 58% carbon. So you have to have those living plants pumping the carbon into the system. So that's probably one of the easiest things to track, to measure. So that's one of the things that people really like to look at. Your aggregate stability, that's a little bit more difficult test, but that's so important when it comes to infiltration of the water that we're getting. Because let's face it, I'm not smart enough to know if we've got global warming or any of this kind of stuff. And most farmers aren't, but I haven't yet to meet a farmer that says our rainfall, our weather is not more erratic than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So the rainfall that we get is more intense and it's less frequent. And so we have to get it into the ground and we have to store it. And that's where that aggregation, keeping that soil covered, keeping your aggregates to where when you get that rainfall, it can go into the ground, and then you have to have the organic matter to hold on to it. So that's another pretty big benefit. And maybe the last one I'll talk about, when we first started doing the cover crops, we looked at, hey, you can virtually eliminate erosion by using no-till and cover crops together. And that was a big deal for us because nobody likes to see their soil erode. So that was a pretty big one. We saw weed control benefits. We saw we could graze cattle on it. The thing that we didn't understand when we first started, 16, 17 years ago, we didn't really understand the biological part of it. And it's not that we understand it really well now, but we at least recognize it. And we're saying we want to know more about it, and we know that this is good for the biological life of the soil. And so now that becomes a much bigger driving force in the decisions that we make. And we know that cover crops are, because all of these organisms, they have to have carbon as their food source, particularly liquid carbon in the form of those root exudates coming out of plants. And if we're only growing crops, 3-4 months out of the year, what are they supposed to eat the rest of the year? You're going to severely hurt your populations. And so we see cover crops as a way to not only increase, but to sustain long-term the biological communities of our soil. And we're going to learn a lot more about that over the next 5-10 years as DNA testing. And there's lots of good sensing and testing things that I see on the horizon that I think will fundamentally change how we look at the soil. And it will fundamentally change decisions that farmers make, because now we can see the biological effects that decisions that we're making have on the soil, whether they're good or bad. Right now, a lot of times we can't even see that.
Thank you for answering all of our questions and sharing such great insights. And so our last guest, we got to play a game, and lucky you, Keith, you get to have a test from us. So we're going to give you, we're going to give you some common scenarios from farmers, and we're going to let you advise on your best approach. And so the first scenario I have for you is, I have a typical dryland corn and soybean rotation, but I wasn't able to get my corn harvested until mid to late October, and I'm going into soybeans next spring. I would like to get some grazing off of the cover crop mix by my cows, if at all possible. What would you suggest for cover crop seed mixes in this scenario?
Where's the geography?
Wherever you'd like. Answers.
Let's just say Bladen for the
Bladen, yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
There you go.
Well, yeah, and I already kind of talked about this a little bit. When we get to the middle of October, I'm going cereal rye. I could still plant hairy vetch that late, and I would feel okay about that. But if I'm coming in with soybeans, I don't really need the nitrogen fixation from that vetch. And the vetch is going to add quite a bit to the cost of that. So I'm probably going to go out there with, at that time of year, I would probably do 60 to 65 pounds of cereal rye. I would want to get it drilled, get it into the ground. And then, depending on what the weather gives me, if this is dry land, hopefully we have a little bit of moisture to get it up, get some snow on it, get it going. What I would be looking at doing then, when you're grazing cereal rye, I tell people you need about 1,000 cows for a month if you're going to graze cereal rye, because you can graze it hard and you can graze it early, but if it gets ahead of you, once cereal rye heads out, it becomes kind of unpalatable. So I would be ready to graze it early. I would try to rotationally graze it, because I can probably graze through the regrowth then a second time. And then I would schedule that to be one of the last fields of soybeans that I planted. And I would do, a little bit shorter maturity group soybean to allow for that, just to allow myself a little bit more time for grazing. And then I would probably be chemically terminating that before planting my beans.
That's a great answer, Keith. That's really good advice for a lot of people, because I think a lot of folks are in that boat. Okay, I have another one. I have a bunch of calving and dirt feed yards, maybe 5 acres worth, that I use in the spring, but they're vacant most of the summer. They always grow up in weeds that are difficult to control. So what would you suggest as a cover crop seed or a mixture and timing of planting if I'd like to get some grazing by my feeder cattle out of those yards before winter, and I kind of want to get rid of some of those weed problems?
Yeah, another good question there. So I would go with we would go with a lot of diversity, because now, we're not constrained with having frost coming in, cold weather. So sorghum, millet, cowpeas, buckwheat, sunflowers. I mean, I could probably come up with 10 or 12 things that I would put in there, and I would probably have 10 or 12 things in there. I would probably pull way back on the amount of legumes, because these type of situations generally have a lot of manure in them. So they're already going to have plenty of nitrogen. So I may just have a sprinkling of the legumes, more for the diversity, more so than for the nitrogen fixing. I would go heavy on the grasses, because that's where I'm going to get the most tonnage. I would not be afraid to do things like, radishes, turnips, collards, because even after it freezes, those are still going to continue on. and give me kind of because I could graze through my warm season mix at least twice during the summer. I could probably get a third grazing with my brassicas later on into the fall. Now, word of warning here, before I turned into all that though, I would take a sample and I'd send it in for nitrates. Because again, especially if you get that planted, it gets growing pretty good, and then you just get hit by a really hard, hot, dry spell. Those sorghums have the ability to kind of stop growing, but unfortunately they've already got all that nitrogen in there, and they can't distribute it through a bigger plant when it stays a small plant. And so we don't want, especially with prices at livestock are right now, we don't want to risk that. So this is where and those tests are cheap and they're easy. Go pull a clipping and send it into a lab and just get a nitrate test to see what that's like. Make sure it's not too hot. If it looks good, then again, yeah, I would rotationally graze that, because you should be able to graze through your warm season stuff twice, and then potentially have a third grazing if you had some brassicas in there as well.
Absolutely. We got one more test scenario for you.
Okay.
I'm a certified organic grower, so of course using glyphosate to terminate cover crops is not an option. But how can I add cover crops and terminate reliably? And what seed mixtures would you suggest if I'm growing organic soybeans next season on the same land?
Okay, so are you soybeans this year and you're going back to soybeans?
Let's go with that example, yes.
Okay. Well, in that scenario, you are really short on carbon, because soybeans are a low carbon crop. So we are going to want to get as much carbon put into that system as possible. Weed control is always top of mind with organic guys. So again, I'm going to cereal rye. Depending on the time of year, I might throw a brassica in there, like rapeseed or camelina or something like that. May or may not overwinter, but if I can get some fall growth, great. If I get some overwintering and get some spring growth, that would be great too. I might also even consider, if I get my rye planted late, I would still plant it, but I wouldn't be afraid to come in the spring after that, after it's kind of warmed up just a bit. As that rye is growing, I could overseed some mustard and a few other things into that as well. Things that wouldn't overwinter, but I could still add some diversity. I could add some weed suppression to that. And so I would let that grow as long as I was comfortable. I would want to get as much carbon into the system as possible. And then you got two options here. You can let that grow out until, anthesis, where that rye is starting to put on a seed head. And you could come in, if you have a good enough roller crimper, you could potentially roller crimp that. And if you're going to roller crimp, this is where diversity is probably a detriment to having the system work really well. Because when you have different plants out there at different growth stages, roller crimp termination is so specific to a growth stage. And so cereal rye by itself is much easier to terminate than a mixture of different things. So if I had rye out there, I would let it head out. I would let it start, shedding pollen, which again, in our area is typically going to be, anywhere from early May to mid-May, depending on how cold or warm the summer was. And then you go out there and you stomp it down hard with a good roller crimper. You need a good one. You can't just drag a harrow through there and expect it to work, because we really need to bend. We don't want to cut, but we need to bend enough of the stem parts to where it can no longer translocate photosynthates down to the roots and moisture and nutrients up to the plant. And then plant my beans right into that. Now, you could plant your beans and then go roller crimp. We've had some guys have pretty good success roller crimping their rye when their beans are at that first or second trifoliate. Scary as heck to do that. So that might not be the first thing that you would try. You could also do some tillage. And if this is dry land, I might be a little bit nervous about letting it go all the way to anthesis, because that's a long time. That's a lot of moisture. And so as an organic guy, I always have tillage in my toolbox as a tool. You want to till absolutely as shallow as possible, because the deeper you go, the more the destructive outcomes of tillage are. So I would not go any deeper than I had to terminate that cereal rye cover crop. And again, the sooner I do that, the easier it is to kind of terminate it that way. So those would be things that I would look at. I would have those two options of either tillage termination or roller crimping, depending on whether I had irrigation and depending on what the spring was giving me moisture wise. But I'll tell you this, if you till it, you will not have any season-long weed control. The cover crop will do a great job with weed control up to that point. And then from that point on, you will get very little benefit of weed control from it. If you can afford to let it go to roller crimp stage, you will have really good weed control the whole season long. And so that's why, especially people further east, the organic guys, we work with Rick Clark and some of these guys that are organic no-tillers, and that's what they're doing. If they can raise 7,000 to 8,000 pounds of dry matter biomass, which is possible, that's a lot, but you can do it. They feel like they'll have pretty good weed control all the way until their soybeans canopy. And then at that point, the soybeans kind of take care of themselves.
Absolutely. And Keith, again, thank you so much for sharing all of those great insights. I know I learned a lot about cover crops. I always say I am not an agronomist. I have a cattle background. So I was excited all the things we talked about, rotational grazing with cover cropping in this episode.
Did I pass the test?
You did pass the test. Yes. I know. Next time we have you on, we'll have to have a game or something for you instead of a test.
Okay. We
but yeah, we hope our listeners can take away some of these recommendations and put them to work right away on their farms as well. And as we wrap up this latest episode, again, Keith, we want to thank you for joining us on FP Next.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And if people are interested, we've got tons of free resources at our website, greencover.com. There's lots of articles, blog posts you can download. We've got over 400 videos for free on our YouTube channel. So there's tons of information out there for the person who wants to learn more.
And we'll have links to Green Cover, with this story, and then some of those resources, Keith. And again, thank you so much for joining us. We sure appreciate it. And to our listeners, if you're on YouTube or our podcast platforms, please leave us a review, and you can always drop us a line at the links below. We love to hear from our listeners about anything and everything, and especially if maybe you have some questions for Keith, we might be able to pass those along and get them answered for you.
Absolutely. And of course, Curt, we say it every time, but I love getting emails, comments on YouTube, reviews, anything from our listeners. And again, we're going to plan on starting to share some of those great comments and thoughts on some of our topics going forward. I know for our next episode, we got some great farmer questions our next guest will be ready to answer. Don't forget to follow along with what's next in agriculture with FP Next and get all the best agricultural insights from Farm Progress. And don't forget to check out the digital edition of your regional publication at farmprogress.com.
A special thank you goes out to our guest today, Keith Berns with Green Cover, but also to our digital production and marketing team members at Farm Progress who put in a lot of work with us.
Absolutely. And on top of sharing your thoughts and please leaving us a review for today's episode, yes, we ask for reviews every single episode, but those reviews really help others in the ag industry find us and help grow our community more and more and share some of these insights.
And if you have topics you'd like us to tackle in the future, please let us know so we can do the research and perhaps bring your solutions that you can use on your own farm and ranch forward to another podcast episode.
Absolutely. And remember, if it's agriculture, your friends at Farm Progress have you covered. Here's wishing you high yields and good weather. We'll see you next time.